Peace be with you. My name is Alan Kiesler. This is the Institute of All Intelligent Life, and we're happy to have you with us. We are going to be discussing a very difficult and important topic today. This is part 3 of our discussion of consciousness, and as we ended the last class with some very good questions, especially one about the grave. So, what happens after death? What happens to the consciousness? What happens to us? What happens to our awareness? So we're just going to wait a minute or two for other people to join. And I'm going to request you once again. Actually, I suggested that everyone do this before the class begins. But especially today, because we're discussing a topic that is very, very difficult for reasons which I will explain in just a minute. And for my own sake also, for my own mind to become more clear and connected, I'm going to do a couple of deep breaths myself and invite you to join me. Again, I repeat, this is a very important practice, and it is very, very helpful to prepare yourself to become free from the mind's chatter. The mind is always saying this, that, the opposite, no, this, I think that. So that interferes with our ability to directly understand and appreciate the truth. That's why this breathing, very simple, very quick exercise that we can do to prepare ourselves better to hear something that may be a little difficult, may be different than what we've thought before. So please join me. Breathing in, I do it to the count of 8, and then exhaling to the count of 16. One more time. One more time, and this time I'm going to suggest that as you do the breathing in your mind, because you can't, of course, speak outside, you can't speak aloud while you're inhaling, although you can do it while you're exhaling, but in your mind repeat the name of God, whatever name of God you find helpful to you, or that you usually practice, or if you don't practice chanting any name of God, then you don't have to do that. But just visualize something very peaceful and beautiful, a beautiful scene. Or if you can, it's extremely powerful, extremely helpful, just chant in your mind, Allahu, 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 or whatever name of God. Again, one more time, we'll do this. Breathe in. I hope you can feel the power in that practice, how the mind becomes peaceful, and just by repeating the name of God, often a lot more than just the mind becoming peaceful happens. The awareness, even the bodily sensations become enlivened. So let us approach this topic now Now let me say as a word of background, the reason why this is so difficult and so important is, of course, because in different traditions, in different religious traditions, and even within each religious tradition, within different groups or different sects of the followers of that religious tradition, there can be quite different ideas about what exactly happens. And perhaps the most astonishing thing that has happened in my lifetime is that in the Western world, in the Christian world, this idea about what happens after death has changed a great deal. And I can remember well, when I was a child, of course I've explained before, I was born, my parents were working in Khanewal, which was part of British India, and when I was born in July of 1947, my parents were in the hill station of Mussoorie, which is in India now, and then we traveled back to Khanewal, to West Punjab, which had become part of Pakistan, just a couple of months after my birth. And then I returned to Mussoorie regularly because I went to school there. So I went back and forth between India and Pakistan practically every year of my first 18 years of my life. And I got to see the difference between not only the ideas that people had, but the ideas they were promoting in their news media, and it was very, very different, opposite, you can say, even in many cases. So from the time I was a child, I developed a desire to try to resolve these sorts of differences between different countries, and particularly between different religions. So, what do different people say about death, and what do extraterrestrials say about death and what happens after death? So, I'm going to prepare myself again, just breathe and chant the name of God in my mind one more time, just to make sure that I'm doing the best possible job I can to present this information to you. So probably all of you are well aware that in different religious traditions there are different ideas about what happens after death. And of course there are many varieties of teachings, but the basic difference that I want to go into now is the idea in some traditions that after death one goes into the grave, that is, the body goes into the grave, and somehow the consciousness of the person remains in the grave with that body until some time which sometimes is considered in the distant future, at other times is considered not so much after death, but at any point there is some time of judgment. And according to the deeds that one has done in that life, one eventually or quickly is judged and then goes to heaven or to hell. If the deeds were good, then one goes to heaven. If the deeds were sinful, then one goes to hell. But there are a lot of varieties in different religious traditions. In Christianity, there's the idea of purgatory, although it's not very popular in Protestant traditions, but in the Catholic tradition it's more popular, that one can also go to some sort of intermediate place and remain there for some time until further development happens. Now what's very interesting is that there's also an idea which has been increasingly denied or rejected by Christians in the 20th and 21st centuries, which was or is that it doesn't really matter so much what you've done, whether you've been good or bad, but it's just a question if you believe. If you believe that Jesus died on the cross for your sins, then you'll go to heaven, and if you don't believe that, you'll go to hell. But we won't discuss that idea. We're just going to discuss one idea, which is, at the time of death, does one somehow go into the grave with the body until one is judged? Or, and this is an alternative idea which is more popular in Eastern traditions, which is that at the time of death one may be judged in some way, but one quite soon returns either to earth or to some other place in a new body, and the soul or the self or the spirit or the awareness or the consciousness of that individual takes birth again. That's often called reincarnation or a transmigration of the soul. So the first question is, why are these two different teachings? Is one right and the other one wrong? Or do both have some degree of truth in them? And why did these different teachings become popular? And most importantly, in terms of our class, what do extraterrestrials say about this issue? So first let me tell you my conclusion, and then I'll explain why I've come to these conclusions. My conclusion is that things are more complicated than we may think. That is, the same thing doesn't happen to everybody. Different things may happen to different people or to different sorts of people according to not only how they've lived their lives, but according to other factors as well. And I think the most important of these factors is what we call the age of the soul. Now, this gets us into another question, which I mentioned a couple of days ago, I think, and that is the question of what happens before birth, or before the soul enters into the body. So this idea corresponds to those two different types of ideas about life after death, and that is, when does the soul come into existence? Is the soul eternal in the past, or does it come into being sometime before birth? Does it come into individual existence? And in other words, although as I explained then, we use the word, or I'm using the word spirit to mean that eternal aspect, the eternal aspect of the self, and we can use the soul to talk more about the individual identity which has a certain start at a certain point in time. So I have no doubt that there is an eternal spirit which is somehow identified with us now, which was eternal in the past. And there is also a soul which may have a beginning in time. So of course, if the soul is reincarnating, then one would hold to the belief that before coming into this body, the soul existed, not only a little while before, but a long time before, millions of years before maybe, and one may have gone through many, many lifetimes previous to this one. So, as I said, things may be more complicated, that the same thing may not happen to everybody, and there may be, not that there are two different types of souls exactly, but there are some souls that are new souls, and there are some souls that are old souls. And the reason I've come to this conclusion is for two reasons. One is my own experience, which I will share with you, and two, there are reasons to believe that some people, when they are born, are much, much more spiritually evolved than others. And some seem to be like spiritual infants, and some seem to be very spiritually mature. So is it possible that some souls have existed for a long, long time and have gone through many experiences, and other souls are just coming into existence? So those traditions that hold that the soul is eternal in the past, I am going to suggest that they are talking about the spirit rather than the soul. And the spirit certainly is eternal in the past, because the soul is a the spirit, I should say, is an eternal outside of time. By eternal, I mean it exists outside of time before entering into time. But it's also possible that there are souls that, at least some of them, that don't exist before coming into time, or not very long before coming into time. And this brings up the question about the number of souls. Are there an infinite number of souls, or is there a finite number? Is there an infinite or a finite number of souls? Because if there is a finite number of souls, then it would seem that the number of souls must be increasing. And if the number of souls is increasing, then some souls at least must be coming into existence, probably within time, or if outside of time, not long before coming into time. So my conclusion about this issue is that we should be open-minded. We should not, cling on to just one idea that we may have been taught from our childhood, but we should be open to the possibility that there are some souls who have existed before and other souls who have just come into existence. Old souls and new souls, we can say. So I said I will talk about my experience also. This may be disturbing to some people, and I'll explain two different ways of interpreting my experience in just a minute if this is too disturbing to you. But I have very clear memories of previous lives, of having lived before I entered this body. So I won't go into the details about that now, but I will say that it can be interpreted. My experience can be interpreted in two different ways. One, that means that I was existing before in other bodies and I had previous lives, or it could mean that I have some sort of connection with somebody who lived before, and that person was not me, but I have a memory of that person's life or those persons' lives, and I'm somehow connected with them, but I'm not identical with them. So I'm going to leave either of those possibilities open, and certainly I'm not the only one. There are many, many people, although it seems to be a fairly small minority, but there are certainly many hundreds and thousands, if not millions of people who have some memories of previous existences, whether it was their own or some other persons who are somehow associated with them. So that's one issue, is did the soul exist before birth or not? And it can be interpreted in either way, but people do have memories. There's a very, very famous American medical doctor, Ian Stevenson, who was at the University of Virginia. He has passed away now, but for many years he did a lot of scientific research and experimentation into this issue, not experimentation so much as research, and he discovered many, especially children, who do have very clear memories of some previous life, and they seem to think, in many cases, that that was themselves. That person who they remember being, that really was them. They identify that way. Although, again, I'm saying I'm leaving open the possibility that it could have been somebody else, some different soul, whose memories they somehow are connected with. All right, so that's the first point, that some people have memories of previous existences, which would tend to be an argument in favor of the possibility that some souls, at least, do exist before entering this body. So, on the other hand, there are many, in fact, by far the larger number of people who don't have any such memories. So that could be for one of two reasons, either because they don't have any such memories, or they do, but they can't remember them. They don't have any such experiences, but they do, but they can't remember them. So I'm wanting to leave both those possibilities open, and the way that I resolve this issue as a possibility, again, because I'm not 100% convinced about either of these, but I'm examining, and I have been for many years, examining the possibility that some souls have just come into existence before this life, and therefore they don't have any previous memories, they don't have any previous lives that they can remember. All right, that's the first issue about the existence of the soul or the spirit or the consciousness before entering this body. So now what about, let's go into a little more detail about what happens after death. And then I'll talk about what different extraterrestrial sources say. So after death, again, there's these different possibilities. One is, and there are a lot of different possibilities. I'm just sort of simplifying the issue. But one, which is Michael Newton, is again another American medical doctor, as I recall, or else a psychologist perhaps. But he did a lot of studies of this topic about what happens to people after they die and what sort of existence did people have before they were born. And he came to the conclusion that, again, this was not his belief. As I said earlier, beliefs in America and in Europe have changed a lot in the last 70 years of my lifetime. And although this idea was practically unknown in the West before, I didn't know anybody in my childhood who adhered to this idea that people could exist before they entered this body, and it's now become quite widespread. But Michael Newton, I believe was his name, he talked about between lives, the time between lives. So his conclusion was that we prepare our lives, and after we die, we go back to a interlife state in which we review our life that we've just experienced, and we prepare for a new life. So that's a fairly new idea. And the reason why he came to this conclusion was because through hypnotic regression, he found that people in their regressed hypnotic states, they talk about a group of friends that they have and that they have had for a long time. And he could not identify those friends as being people that they remembered in any of their previous lives as they remembered. So then he realized that those people have a group of friends that they meet in between lives, and they're sort of consultative committee, and they meet with those friends and they discuss, as I said, they review their past life, and then they discuss the situation that they should enter into in their next life. So that's one understanding of what happens after death that is quite, in my experience at least, it's fairly new. It's only happened within the 20th century. So going back to the other two prominent ideas, one, that the soul goes into the grave with the body, and two, that the soul immediately goes on into another life. So associated with that idea of the soul going into the grave with the body is the idea of the day of resurrection. And this is something that extraterrestrial sources definitely talk about. And it's very, very interesting to try to correlate that belief about the day of resurrection as a day when people rise up out of their graves with the idea of a day of resurrection that extraterrestrials have definitely held to, at least some of them. And that's the idea which I've mentioned before of a cycle which we associate with the precession of the equinoxes of about 25,000 years, in which major changes happen at the end of that cycle or the beginning of a new cycle. And at some point, maybe not the first 25,000 year cycle, but some people say the third of those 25,000 year cycles, but in any case, at one point, there is some general change, some large change that happens on that planet, the entire planet, not just a day of judgment for one individual or each individual separately. And that day of judgment seems to me quite clearly to correspond with the idea that's present in some religions, especially Semitic religions, that there is a general day of resurrection or day of judgment. And as I've said before, I have no doubt that that is the time period that we're living in right now, and this is the conclusion of many, many thinkers and extraterrestrial sources also, that the time period that we're living in right now is one of those days of judgment or one of those cyclical periods when a major transformation happens. So this is, as it's described in the Law of One books, this is a point of time where the entire planet moves to a higher level of existence. As I think I've mentioned briefly, but not very much, from the third density to the fourth density. And that's another discussion about what these densities are. But it means the entire planet moves to a higher level of existence, which seems to imply, and this I'm not 100% clear on or convinced of, but it seems that what's related with this is that those, either whether they were souls that went into the grave with the bodies, or whether they were souls that didn't do that but continued in some other dimension or in this dimension, but at that time there is a general transformation. There is a big change that takes place. So let me just say that I'm convinced that this is the source of those understandings in, for example, Islam and Christianity, especially being the two largest religions in the world. It's prominent, this idea, that idea that the soul may go into the grave with the body and then is resurrected on the day of resurrection or the day of judgment, that is possible, and it's referring to a period of time when the entire population of the planet will have an opportunity to rise to a higher level of consciousness. So that's that, and this seems to be quite clear that extraterrestrials are aware of this phenomenon, which we in at least Western history, of course, and Western psychology and Western religious teachings also have not been very aware of, that this day of judgment not only happens once, but it happens regularly from time to time. Not only on our planet, but on all planets, they go through these sort of cyclical progressions. Okay, now what about the other idea? And my conclusion is, and this is pretty widespread among extraterrestrial groups, is that it is possible for the soul not to just go into the grave with the body, although some souls may do that. I believe, in fact, that that's possible, that some souls go into a sort of dormant or sleeping state after death and are not revived until some event in the future, which is not an individual judgment, but is a group judgment. But it is possible that other individuals do not do that. And in fact, it's interesting that in some traditions, like in Islam, it's also said that many individuals, especially those who are martyred on the battlefield, they don't go into the grave, but they go directly to heaven. So I think we need to be aware that things are more complicated. Not the same thing happens to everybody. And it's possible that not only those who die on the battlefield, but others also, perhaps because of spiritual advancement or for a variety of reasons, they don't go into the grave with the body to go to sleep until the day of judgment, but they can go on immediately to some other sort of existence. And it's possible. I think we need to be open to this possibility, even if it may be contrary to our religious instruction that we've received. We should be open to the possibility that at least some people have had pre-existence, perhaps, and after this body's demise, after death, they can go somewhere else and may go to heaven or hell, or may take birth again in some other situation, some other planet. What is hell or heaven? They may be other planets, or perhaps here. And there, as I've said, there's a lot of evidence that something like this does happen, at least to some people. So, I'm going to end this discussion now, and I'm just going to check the time here. Okay, it is just about half an hour, which is what I want to do for the class, and now I'll look at the questions, and I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions about this, and people are going to, I can see it's a lot more than usual. Okay, let me go back to the first questions and see what we have here. Rian Khan, why count till 16? That's just arbitrary. You can make any number. You can make it 20, yes, as you suggest, no problem. Depends on how fast you count also. The idea is just to breathe in and then breathe out a little more slowly and take a little bit longer on it, maybe about twice as long. Okay, we're not going to talk about that issue anymore. We want to get to the question. Okay. Naim Haider asks, are the martyrs lying in their graves along with their souls? I think this is quite clear that everyone accepts, Muslims accept, that the martyrs are not lying in their graves, although Muslims generally, or maybe some Muslims, I think there are many Muslims who don't, but many Muslims think that everyone lies in the grave except the martyrs, but it's quite clear that the martyrs do not. I think I'm right on that from what I experience, what I've learned. Alan, are you Muslim? Okay, this question comes up again and again, and the answer is yes or no, depending on your definition of Muslim. That I do believe that there is only one God, La ilaha illallah. I do believe the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, is the Prophet of God. So by that definition, I'm certainly a Muslim. But I also believe all other religions are true. And if a Muslim can believe that, then I'm a Muslim. And I also believe that I don't need to follow all the Muslim rules and regulations because I pray every day. I do pray namaz, but only once usually, although maybe I'll increase that gradually. But I also pray the prayers of other religious traditions, and that is also very meaningful to me. So I may not be a Muslim if you think that that's not the proper thing for a Muslim to do. Is our soul a matter? Very good question. I would say no. The soul is conscious, and the consciousness is not matter. As I explained 2 days ago, the first discussion I had of consciousness is that the matter does not create consciousness, as modern biology teaches, but the consciousness pre-exists the matter, and the consciousness is actually the source of the matter. So consciousness, or the soul, is not a matter. It is a spiritual, it's a real thing, but it's a spirit, it's a spiritual reality. It's conscious. So, Honorable Sir, beliefs are beliefs. I do respect all. Wants to say something more about souls. As I have stated earlier, have seen a soul in the shape of white smoke after having walked with me for a few seconds. Besides, sir, for your observation, I must mention that in sky you can see their gatherings in shape of white cloud, having some shape. Cloud of souls is purely off-white and is different than other clouds in color and effects. So I'm not sure quite how this relates to our discussion today, but I can certainly accept that you have seen a soul in the shape of white smoke. But it would be interesting to see how if you've had any observations of what happens to that white smoke or that soul after a person dies. Does the white smoke leave the body, and then do you see it go somewhere, or what? Why are there good souls and bad souls by default? Very good question, and there are different answers to that. Of course, there's a very well-known Christian belief of predestination, where some people are good and some people are bad by God's decree before they were born. And there's no other explanation but that God made it that way. I personally don't accept that God would make bad souls. I think that the soul is by nature good, but because we have freedom, we can choose to become good or bad. So it's not by default, it's by the choice of the soul. What is the difference between a spirit and a soul? This is all a matter of definition. Many people use the words to mean the same thing. I have suggested that we can use the words spirit to mean to that aspect of the individual identity or the consciousness which is eternal in the past, which in other words was with God outside of time before this world was created. It's eternal in the past. Whereas the soul can be used for the individual identity that begins within time, or maybe shortly before entering into time. So that's just a definition that I've given for those two words, which you may use any words to mean anything, but this is the definition that I've given. which may be different than other people's definitions, and that's okay. How can I identify the existence of a soul around us? I'm not sure if you mean the soul within us, or the soul, our own soul, or some other soul that may be nearby us. We can actually sense the presence of another soul. And I don't know if identify you mean identify who that person may be. So there's a lot of things about your question, I'm afraid, that are not clear exactly what you mean, so I'm going to go on. What is out-of-body experience and how can one practice it? Out-of-body experience, which I've explained I have had, means I have experienced myself actually going up near the ceiling of the room and looking down and seeing my body below. And many, many people have had that sort of experience. Very commonly it happens when a person dies scientifically. The brain stops functioning, the heart stops beating, and the person can still remember what happened when he was clinically dead or she was clinically dead, and then is revived later. So that is one sort of out-of-body experience. And how can one practice it? Again, this is a long answer, and I can say briefly that the Monroe Institute, founded by Robert Monroe, and it teaches this. It actually teaches how to practice having out-of-body experiences. Robert Monroe's first book was called Journeys Out of the Body, and in there he describes how it started happening to him without him willing it, and he thought he was going crazy actually, and after some time he realized that he was just going out of his body, and then he developed the practices how to do it when he wanted to. So that's a long answer, which I won't go into more detail, but you can look up Monroe Institute if you want, or there are many other groups of individuals who are teaching how to travel out of your body if that's what you want to learn to do. You can do internet searches. Of course, be careful. Some are better than others, but I know the Monroe Institute is a good one because I've gone to their programs myself, and I did that out-of-body travel. And of course, I learned when I did it the first time that, oh, I've been doing this before also. I didn't quite understand it as thoroughly as I did after having done it with them. So I'm asking because yesterday someone asked you about it. Okay, so I've answered that question, I hope, enough for now. How do you define freedom with regards to our body and this life? I don't think that's, again, very clear, because this can mean quite a few different things. Freedom, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question distinctly. I would have to ask you to define what you mean by freedom. If you mean the ability to travel out of the body, is that the freedom you're talking about? Then I could define it as when the consciousness leaves the body, then you're free to go anywhere. And all right, I've already answered this question about whether I'm a Muslim. Akhlaq Hussein, according to Islam, all souls were created 50,000 years before creation of the universe. So we're all at least 5 billion years old. Well, I've never heard this before. This is very interesting. If all souls were created, a long time ago, does that mean there are a finite number of souls? Anyway, I really can't say too much about that because I've never heard this before, and I don't know how widely Muslims accept that idea. Rihan Khan says, I am confused. Some souls does exist before entering the body, and some are not, and spirits are eternal. This is what you have mentioned in your talk so far. So how would you distinguish between all three? There's a slight misunderstanding here. What I've done is define spirit as that aspect of the self or the consciousness that is eternal in the past, whereas I've defined soul as that aspect of the individual that begins at some point in time. Perhaps, at least for some people, just before birth or some time while the body of the child is in the mother's womb or at the time of conception. But at some time the soul, as opposed to the eternal spirit, comes into existence as that individual. That is the definition I've given for those words. And so the question now is about souls. The spirit of everyone is eternal. That's the defined word, the eternal in the past as well as future. Whereas some souls exist before entering the body and some not. Yes, this is the question, the very important question that I'm exploring. Is it possible that some souls do exist before entering the body and some don't? There's a very interesting passage in the Bible where somebody asks Jesus a question, and he replies, "Before Abraham was, I am." So that seems pretty clear that at least Jesus was saying, if we accept that, Jesus was saying that he existed before he entered his body, and long before, even before the time of Abraham. And many Muslims accept that the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, existed eternally in the past. There's the idea among some Muslims called Nuri Muhammad, the light, the eternal light, which is identified with Muhammad. So, yes, there may be some souls that are eternal in the past, or at least have lived a long time in the past, and other souls that just came into being, not the spirit again, but the soul of that individual person came into being shortly before birth. So I hope that's clear. Don't be confused. That's what I'm saying now. It may be confusing that how could there be two different types of souls, but maybe they're not different types. Maybe all of them go through that process of coming into some sort of individual existence at some point, and then remaining in existence after that. And then this is another whole total different question, but then do all souls remain eternally in existence after they have once come into existence? Or is it possible that some souls, especially very sinful ones or ones that don't want to exist, they become so hellishly oriented that they want to themselves stop existing, and is that possible? But we're not going to get into that now. Okay, so Akhlaq was saying, Adam, peace be upon him, is only 50 or 60,000 years old after the fourth ice age. Okay, so this is a totally different question about the history of the human race. How old is the humanity on this planet? And let me just say one thing in this regard. I have a group of very good friends in Lahore, and I've often met with them, and I think I've mentioned before, perhaps not in this class, but I have mentioned certainly before on my Facebook page that we used to meet when I was in Lahore. We would meet regularly and read the Masnavi, Rumi's Masnavi. And that group of gentlemen, occasionally there was a woman there also, but usually they were all men, and they told me that according to their understanding at least of the Islamic teachings, there have been many Adams. So I think that's a pretty widespread belief. So the Adam that you are talking about, the Adam of our historical experience, whether he was 50 or 60,000 years ago, or some people say 200,000 years ago, some people in the older Christian belief used to say that that was only 5,000 years ago about, or 4,000 years ago. So it's very possible that there was a person, prophet, named Adam, who lived about 50 or 60,000 years ago. But that doesn't mean that there was no previous Adam. That doesn't mean that there were no people existing either on this planet or in other places before that. So I think it's clear, to me it's very clear from extraterrestrial sources, that our history is much more than 50 or 60,000 years. Hundreds of thousands, millions, maybe even billions of years, but certainly many millions of years, there have been human beings very much like us, that looked like us on this planet long, long ago, much more than the time that modern science and anthropology says of a few tens or hundreds of thousands of years, but millions and maybe even a couple of billion years ago. So Muhammad Omar is saying, Arwah is where the souls are before it enters this world after death. It's called Barzakh, where it waits the day of judgment. Yes, so this Arwah, this is very good. This would be what I call spirit. That is the existence of the soul before, eternally in the past. That seems to be what you're saying. So maybe the souls were present in that spiritual form before, or maybe it was what I'm calling the spirit that's eternal in the past, and some sort of individual identity begins when it enters this world. And Barzakh is the place where the soul awaits the day of judgment. Yes, I'm very well aware of that idea, whether it's in the grave or whether it's in a place underneath the ground, which seems to be an older Jewish idea called Sheol, that there's some sort of place which was usually identified as being under the ground, where souls go after they die, and perhaps awaiting some day of judgment. So that is a common idea, yes. Akalaku saying, souls do not rest in old bodies after death. They are given new bodies which are not physical, and they are kept in other dimensions called barzakh. Well, okay, that's another understanding. Maybe it's not a Muslim idea, but certainly some Christians have, and I think it was more popular in the past, more widespread I should say, that the soul somehow remains in the body, in the grave, and then will be raised up at the day of judgment. So if that's not the Muslim understanding, thank you for clarifying that the souls don't remain in the body, but they are in some other dimension. What is extraterrestrial? Very simple, meaning those beings who do not live on this planet, who live on other planets. That's the definition of an extraterrestrial. So Muhammad Omar, recommend people stop listening. This is a joke. No, this is not a joke. I may be wrong, I may be completely wrong, but I'm definitely very, very serious about this, and I am sincerely trying to understand what is the truth here, and why, especially, why do different people have different ideas about this? Why do different religious traditions teach different things? And I'm trying to understand that very, very seriously. So we have an idea that Barzakh is in fact a corridor between galaxies, so I think there are different ideas here. Did our soul agree to descend to a certain family before? That's very possible. Did our souls generally agree to descend, or particular family or ethnicity? Are we given a choice to descend in a certain family? Again, if we say yes, then we would have to say that the soul exists before entering this body and chooses in which family or ethnicity to enter. Certainly, as Michael Newton's research shows, that's exactly what happens, that the soul meets even with a group of friends and makes that decision as to what family, what ethnicity to enter, and everything about the lifetime. So, why are some born in rich family, others born in poor families? Same about religions and castes. Was there any reward to choosing where to descend? So again, all of these questions relate to this issue, this primary issue that I'm discussing about whether the soul exists before this lifetime. And if it does, then there's no difficulty in understanding that some get born in a rich and some in a poor family because of their previous activities. They deserve to get that sort of life or this sort of life, or it's beneficial for their continued advancement if they're born in that sort of family or this sort of family. The traditional Christian answer to that question is that that's God's will, that some people are born in a rich family and others poor. Because traditionally Christians, well, I should say, not traditionally, because in the very early Christian church, the idea was much more widespread than it became later, that souls can exist before entering this body. And some great church leaders even held to that idea. But after 300 or 400 years after Christ, the decision was made by church leaders, and then it became the doctrine which was enforced, and people had to believe it, that there is no existence of the soul before. So, but if that's the case, then there's no other explanation than that it's God's will that some people are born in a rich family or poor family. So, souls are conscious in a sense that they can choose a person, Abdul Razik writes, to move along with him or her in shape of white smoke moving in circles, and can move upwards towards sky, besides have an ability to make, to make others feel their reaction like touch, even of aggressive nature. All these facts are personally experienced by me and might be a help in further research regarding souls. Maybe aliens are more aware about souls than us, maybe less. I'm very happy that you're explaining all this, because I think you're right that these sorts of experiences that people have can help in further research regarding souls. And I'm very interested to learn about such experiences that people have. And I have been studying such experiences that people have, and I have learned a lot from them. So I think it's quite possible, again, it may not be universal, but it can be experienced by people, that a soul can be evident to somebody in the form of a white smoke moving in circles. And you can actually feel the presence of such souls, maybe as a white smoke, or maybe not in any particular form, but as you can just sense the presence of somebody. And many people, including myself, I've sensed the presence of especially deceased relatives after they've died, and had conversations with them. And I remember my own mother telling me after her older brother, who she respected and loved very much after he passed away, she felt that he was present and was speaking with her. And after she passed away, I definitely felt her presence, and also had dreams about her, which were very instructive and very helpful to me in my life. So I think it's true, definitely, what you're saying, that we can feel the presence. And it may be a reaction like touch, even of an aggressive nature. Yes, sometimes their presence can be quite strongly felt, and almost like a strong touch, yes. And I think that many aliens are more aware about this whole issue than we generally are. And I'm trying to integrate that knowledge that I am receiving from extraterrestrials. And let me just say a couple of things about that before we move on. That there seems to be some difference, again, amongst extraterrestrials about this. And that difference, the different ideas that they talk about, may be either because they are only telling us a certain amount of what they know, what we're ready to hear, or it may be that they in fact have different ideas amongst different groups of extraterrestrials. So I'm still studying that and trying to understand what is the reason why some extraterrestrials talk about the soul existing eternally and passing through many bodies, many lifetimes, and some talk about the soul appearing on this earth in this body, and then after death moving on, not getting reborn on this planet. So even among extraterrestrials, these two different ideas exist, and I don't know if they exist because of what they're teaching us, or it exists because that's what they themselves believe. So it's a very, very interesting question. I'm sorry that I can't give a definitive answer to that from my extraterrestrial sources, because I have come across extraterrestrial sources that have different ideas too. So let's continue this discussion. All right, so I think our time is about up. I'll just look at the last question that has just come up by Faraz Mubarak. So about dead body and reward of his deeds will be through consciousness, and what do you think can we call our soul as consciousness? This is a very good question. What is the relationship between consciousness and the soul? In one sense, I think just as a sort of approximation, we can identify the soul as consciousness and consciousness as the soul, that the soul is a conscious spark of consciousness. There may be some distinction if we get into finer aspect, but certainly they are closely associated with each other. All right. Faraz, you've asked another question. What if we are in a dream presently and we will be alive in our death? That's a very, very interesting question. And a number of great thinkers of different traditions have raised this question of when we're in a dream, we experience that reality as being real. And then when we wake up, that dream feels sort of like just a dream. Now, what if we are now dreaming, and we will wake up at the time of death and think about this lifetime as just a dream? So that is something to think about more. All right. Thank you all very, very much. We will continue this discussion about consciousness, and I hope I've made it clear my position, which I'm personally not, I don't have a simple answer. I think there are different possibilities, and maybe there are different types of people that have different experiences after death, and maybe there are different types of people that had different sorts of experiences before birth also. Okay, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, inshallah, and may God protect us all.